States is very much starting at a place of what we call screen scraping, where to get access to your banking data, I would actually go into, let's just say, the bank's portal that you otherwise would use and go screen scrape it and put the username and password into it. The banks hated it, rightfully so, because it's an insecure thing to do, and it would also impose things on their front end. And so as a result of that, it created a dialogue with the banks that I think has been a very productive dialogue, which is, how do we make this secure for the consumer? Because we're not saying you can't have the data, we get it. The consumer should have access to their data, but everybody, from an ecosystem perspective, let's do it in a safe and secure way. So I think the industry started solving its own problems, and I think therefore the CFPB, which has had this mandate, has been slow to act, waiting for industry to do what it has been doing, which is taking the measures, setting up industry standards, and getting there to protect the consumer and to provide the services to the consumer. So I think consumers have benefited from it. I think there are a lot of people out here using Venmo. I think a lot of people use tax preparation software. If people use Quicken Loans, right, just as an example, people are leveraging the tools and they're getting the availability of those tools. So I think the consumer benefit is happening. I think industry is making it available and safe for individuals. And so that's where I think in the US we're in a very different perspective than where we are in Europe because of the industry-led approach that the regulators don't feel like they need to step in, as opposed to in Europe where the regulators felt that they had to step in a little more.
So it's almost a combination of market forces and the nudge by policymakers.
Yes.
And so that maybe that's part of the mix.
It is, and I also think the dialogue that winds up happening over the course of these implementations is very useful, because I don't think the regulators understood in Europe the need for an economic incentive. Mm-hmm. But now, based upon the comments from the regulators, they get it. Mm-hmm. That there need to be some economic incentives. I think the US, because they saw what happened in Europe, the industry learned. And could shift, and I think the regulators also understand that and have learned.
So disaster helps too, kind of.
Well,
or not just.
Never let a crisis go to waste, right? I think is the mantra.
Europe is kind of helpful in that way.
Yeah,
in
sometimes,
some
yes.
ways.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so Rochelle, I'm curious your thoughts on the Precision Medicine Initiative, which you probably may have heard of, and I'm sure Rochelle would explain it a little better than I, but. What are your thoughts on how the policy and engineering components of that initiative occurred? Do you think that was successful? Do you think the different components worked together in a successful way? And the API component of the PMI, do you think that was helpful or harmful to it?
Well, that's a really good question. I think we're still figuring that out. And one of the reason I say that is because I'm conducting research and engagement with at Duke Margolis with the All of Us Research Program, which is...
Could you explain to the audience what it is?
Absolutely. So the All of Us Research Program is a precision, or it was born out of the 21st Century Cures Act Precision Medicine Initiative, essentially to recruit individuals, a extremely diverse range, intentionally diverse range of individuals across the United States, encouraging them to participate in the All of Us Research Program registry, allowing the registry access to their electronic medical records, their genomic data, their wearables data, any digital health data that they'd be willing to share. The initiative is very intentional about, as I mentioned, making sure that diversity is front and center. So thinking about diversity from a race, ethnicity, ancestry, gender, geographic location standpoint, you name it. And so far, the initiative has been successful. However, as they enter into year 5 of this initiative, they're trying to maintain that success, and then also they recently rolled out their Return of Results initiative, or I would say a milestone for the program, where they are returning genomic test results to participants that were willing to enroll in the program. So they're returning genomic results that may be clinically actionable, the reports might include what's called variants of unknown significance, where we don't know yet what this genetic test result means, but it could be implicated in your healthcare, but it might not be. It's still up in the air. At least the science is not very clear or well elucidated. And so as they're doing that, they're thinking about what does that mean for the diverse population, or for the diverse populations that they're trying to engage. And then also, again, going back to privacy and security engineering, I think one of the major issues that have come up within this program is privacy in the form of data discretion and data use. So essentially, as scientists have access to the All of Us Research Program Workbench, which is an online tool, cloud-based platform that allows researchers access to the data, access to identifiable information about the participants in order to conduct research, whether it's research, just for generalizable knowledge, or research for other purposes that might be in the interest of the populations that they're assessing. My research is focused on the African American populations, or African identifying populations within the program. And so every population that is participating in the program has a very different idea about privacy, and they also have very different ideas about what their genomic test results might mean as well, and whether or not they want it to be shared with anyone, and whether or not they want the program to even share it with themselves. So I say that because I don't know if anyone here might have heard, but there were some concerns among the indigenous population here about how their data was being used in the program. It was quite a big deal. A scientist published a work that the community did not agree to and was offended essentially by. And so I say that to remind us about the data discretion part of all of this, data discretion being a form of data privacy, and then also trust and transparency across that data lifecycle. As you curate and disseminate the data, what message are you getting across? Is it the right message for our community, and is it the right message for people outside of our community? So that, and then also within the African American population, we're seeing that there are concerns about the data even being returned to the participants, because, say, for example, a participant learns about their genetic risk for a certain disease. They're concerned about their insurers having access to that data. They're concerned about being able to participate in healthcare as a result. They're concerned about whether or not their insurers would even allow them to qualify for follow-up care based on that result. Oftentimes, the follow-up care is denied. And so therefore, it creates more strain, more financial strain, more psychological and emotional strain for them. And then also sometimes the intersection of data discretion interacts with health belief. So sometimes, for example, participants will say, well, I don't want to know about my test result because then I might just start thinking myself sick. Once I learn about my health risk, I might start subconsciously engaging in behavior that might make me succumb to this illness that you've told me I'm at risk for genetically. So I say all this to say that, to your question, has it been successful? I think, again, the answer is always it depends. It depends on the person, the population, how they want their data to be used by themselves and by others in society, by healthcare. We still have a lot of questions that we need to address and a lot of challenges to sort of disentangle on a case-by-case basis. And in addition to that, we have a lot of training to do among even researchers to get them to understand what data privacy and discretion really means. And as we think about privacy engineering and the role that privacy-enhancing technologies play in all of this, I think that's still very nascent. Thinking about, for example, synthetic data as one of many privacy-enhancing technologies. How do we consent participants in precision medicine to the transformation of their data into synthetic data? How do they even know what that means? So there's a, yeah, so there are some consent models that we need to develop even around that.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that even not just the public, but even key stakeholders like, for example, the FDA, like what are their thoughts about synthetic data and how acceptable that could be in applications that they receive? How are they sure that it's not, that the synthetic data they're receiving, or even differential privacy, for example, where noise is introduced into a data set, how are they sure that that is actually reliable when it hits their desk, as they have to make very important decisions about drug efficacy and safety for the population at large? So we're already at, or at least probably from a regulatory standpoint, they're already at risk of approving a drug that's not safe and effective for the general population based on clinical trial data. So if you make that process even more complicated or unclear, then how confident will they be about all of these technologies and techniques? So again, when we think about privacy engineering, yes, the science is great, the concepts are great, but the real world practice is a little different. Mm-hmm. And that's what the precision, I would say, to your question about whether or not it's been successful or where are we at with precision medicine, mm-hmm. I would say that's where we're at, where I think the more we develop and the more we build and learn and know, the more questions we have about what to do with all of that and within the scope and practice of precision medicine. Mm-hmm. So we're not there yet, but we're getting there.
No, I think that's a great answer, and it certainly seems clear that it's outstripped policy's ability to keep up with it. And so I guess that leads me to you, Naomi, when you mentioned the work I think that you said you were doing or looking towards around privacy-federated learning, because that really, I think, is interesting. My instinct is to go towards a public model of that, but obviously that's maybe a ways off, because I think it would be great for the public to be able to access that at some point down the road to do their own AI experiments, right? But I'm curious how you deal with, when you talked about policy sort of not really knowing how to layer and seeing it as almost a barrier to doing that. But I'm curious as to what policy would even apply to that data, because how do you know what that data is, right? Because most policy is about the data, what data type it is. So I'm curious how that mix of data would even be, you would have characteristics, right? How you would even qualify what that type of data is, because that is a huge problem, right? That I think Ellie brought up, just that data gets so mixed up, and it is so difficult now to break apart into these categories. That's one of the reasons policy is so outdated, that I'm curious how you have or how you will deal with that problem in engineering.
So that, I would say, goes back to why I wanted to talk about, introducing this concept of, privacy being more risk-based and following a more risk-based approach. Because, what we did with the NIST privacy framework, which was, a little surprising to people, was that we just refused to use any term like personal data or personally identifiable information. And we just said, this is about data and data processing, because our model doesn't care what your definition is. It simply cares, like, what are you doing with data, and what's the likelihood that that could create what we consider a problematic data action, that is some adverse effect on people, on individuals or groups. And once you're in that space, your definition doesn't matter. And so all of these issues of combining data and sort of like, did we combine, is it health data, is it not health data, again, doesn't matter. It simply matters, is there, what's the likelihood that there's going to be some kind of adverse effect?
Well, how would it handle, then, say, Rochelle's problem with individuals having different, consent or ideas about different forms of data, and genetic data, which is obviously intrinsically identifiable?
So in that world, so if you ran our methodology and used our tool, you would come out with these sort of contextual factors and these sort of issues of, this proportion of, people that were, processing their data on, or this set of people, feel this way about this data. And so the issue of consent is sort of the last point in the process, because consent is essentially, in this world, a type of control, right? And so rather than starting from that point, the point is, where are the adverse effects? And now what's the most effective way to mitigate these risks, assuming that you've decided that they're grave enough to mitigate, right? Then what's the best control or set of controls? And consent might be one of them for some groups, and it might not be necessary for others. And so they might be perfectly happy with you saying, we put in this privacy enhancing technology, don't worry about it, but you're happy, and they're happy, right? And that's why also we came up with a set of privacy engineering objectives that are complementary to the security ones of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Ours are predictability, manageability, and disassociability. And so predictability isn't about saying you have to tell everybody every detail. It's more about, do they have a reliable assumptions about what is happening with data? And if that's good, then they're good. And that might just mean, like, we didn't have to tell them everything. We just put in privacy enhancing technologies so that they could have that trust. But others might need more information, right? Mm-hmm. So it really, the point of risk management is to not think about it the way we've thought about it in privacy, which is everybody gets this blanket notice that nobody reads, but hey, I checked the box on compliance. Mm-hmm. It's more of like, is this effective? Like, what privacy benefit are people getting? And then you can tailor your controls appropriately.
Oh, great. So I think our time is up. So I just want to thank all of you. No, there's a great answer, a great discussion. Thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts with us. And join me in thanking them, please.
Seconding the thanks. So it was a terrific conversation. So we'll take a short break now, about 5 minutes, and then we'll kick over to a one-on-one fireside chat, and we'll flow straight into the engineering panel from there. If my panelists can all get mic'd up in the back, that would be terrific, and then we'll move a little more quickly through that section. But yeah, please help yourself to coffee and food in the back. So we'll just take a little bit of a shorter break on this side. If everybody wants to sort of meander back, we'll get rolling with the fireside chat. We'll give everybody a few moments, but have a seat here when you have a second. Great, and I think we are getting kicked off here. So again, I'm Ellie Graydon. I'm a research professor here at Georgetown, and I'm here with Rob Sherman, who's going to introduce himself. But we are going to have a bit of a conversation about how we move from this policy domain into the engineering domain. How does this feed into what the engineering needs to be, and how we engineer those systems to really effectively meet the policy requirements. So Rob, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself first?
Sure. Well, I feel like everybody in the previous panel introduced themselves by saying, here's my job title, but here's what I actually do. So maybe I'll pick up on that. So my job title is I'm a vice president for data policy and deputy chief privacy officer at Meta. And so what that actually means, I guess I would describe my role as a translator and as a solution builder, and actually very relevant to the conversation that we're about to have, thinking about how to translate what we discuss in the policy space and what the expectations are of how a company like Meta across our different products and services will handle data, and how to actually operationalize that in a way that works. And so that takes a bunch of different forms, but broadly trying to think about how to build things that are valuable to people, and do that in a way that meets expectations.
Yeah, that's great. So wanted to dive right in. You've been at Meta since 2012, and we've been talking about the exponential growth of data itself, but there's also the exponential speed at which technology is evolving. And we all know policy does not move that quickly. One of the things that came up at dinner last night was that we finally got privacy stated in the State of the Union address, and it's taken 15 years to get that word in. And I think it's this disconnect between the rate of technological change, the speed and the growth of data, versus the policy that tries to keep up. So I'd love to hear, especially sort of given your career arc, where have you seen this work well? What makes it work well when it does work well? Where and how do we have policy that keeps up?
Well, maybe starting with something that you said in your introduction at the beginning of the day, I think one of the challenges is very often the policy and legal space is using different language to address problems than we think about in the product or engineering space. And I think one of the reasons why I'm excited about the conversation today is because it really helps to bridge that. But I think, I and my team, we see that, and folks across the company who are working on privacy really see that in a very tangible way, because I'm a lawyer by training. We use words all the time like reasonableness, and we say, okay, but you should act in a reasonable way in doing such and such thing. And then when you go to an engineer and say, I want you to code this product, this system to act reasonably, just don't have any idea what you're talking about. There's no way to do that. And I think it comes from this fact that there is very rapid technological change. So the way that we would solve that as a lawyer is by having broader standards like reasonableness. And then we can decide later what reasonableness means. From an engineering standpoint, you need to build the system to do a particular thing and then update it regularly over time. And so bridging that becomes really important. The way that I think about this in terms of the work that we do is building expectations about how we handle data, both how we use data to create value for our community and also how we protect it and use it responsibly, building it into our system, our products and systems in a way that is consistent and robust and doesn't require everybody who builds a product at our company to understand what reasonable means or to understand the specifics of what's expected when it comes to data protection. And so, you mentioned I've been at the company for about a decade now, which is a long time in like any years, but I think especially for a tech company where, when I started, and so I think we've been trying to do the same basic thing in all of those contexts, but what it's looked like has evolved a lot because the challenges are just a lot more nuanced and complex. And I think, Naomi, you talked about that in your conversation too. So, when I joined the company, a lot of the challenges were, audience, making sure that people, if you share a photo on Facebook and I'm not your friend and you're only sharing it with friends, everybody in the company doesn't need to know to check audience, but we definitely shouldn't be showing your photo to me if I'm not eligible to see it. Or another one that's more recent is deletion. So, thinking about across complex distributed systems, how do we delete data? So that's sort of where we started. Where we are now is in these, more complex, more nuanced spaces. Like, how do we think about minimizing the data that we collect in places where we don't need it? So one example is building this idea of an anonymous credential service. So, which is something that we've open sourced and we use on WhatsApp. So when you're typing in the business that you want to contact, you have to run a search, but ideally the server wouldn't know it's Ellie looking for these things. And so, and I think so allowing an authorized person to get access to this, but translating it in a way that makes sense and that doesn't require the creation of additional data is a really important thing. I mean, in your question about sort of where have we seen this work, I think actually something Anish said earlier really resonated for me, which is this idea of multi-stakeholderism and thinking about things as an ongoing effort. Because I think if you sort of start from the premise of, Congress or a state legislature or whoever will sort of write a bunch of rules and throw them over the fence, and then somebody on the other side will catch them and implement them. As technology evolves, it just becomes very difficult to do that. And so I think actually it's really critical to bring everybody into one space and talk about this. One place that I think, you talked about ChatGPT, and I think, I think it's probably clear to everybody in the room that we're going to be spending a lot of time on AI in the coming, months and years. One of the things that we've actually been doing that I'm really excited about, and I hope we'll do more of, is this idea of policy prototyping. So we have a program called Open Loop that we've participated in along with governments and small and large businesses from around the world. And the idea is basically, let's take an idea that we think might work, right? So how do you do this kind of AI governance, for example? And let's just try it, right? So we'll try it at our scale, and then small businesses and startups try it at their scale, and we just figure out what our experience is. And then we learn, okay, this was really effective, this didn't work, and we need to do it in a different way. And I think that can't happen once, but if it happens on an ongoing basis, I think it actually gets to much better outcomes, both for people and for the people that regulate and the people that are regulated.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that raises in my mind is this difference between big P policy, sort of policy that's written down by regulators and pushed through Congress, versus small p policy. And what it sounds like to me is that you're describing small p policy and the sort of test bed incubation, what's going to work when you're actually trying to implement a system. But I think there's this question, at least in my head, for how we move from, and really move effectively from small p policy, the sort of how do we implement these things within a company, within a specific institution, and move that into big P policy that then is rational and works, and that you can write down as engineering spec without it just being a check the box function. So that really gets to this sort of duality or sort of multiplex nature of what data are and which buckets they fall into and how we regulate those. When we have these data that cross domains, how do you write good little p policy for that? How does that then marry up to big P policy?
So on the little p side, I mean, I think it's a very prescient question. I mean, I think the mouse and Parkinson's example that you gave earlier is a really good one, because I don't think anybody would argue that a computer shouldn't collect mouse movements. You have to do that in order to use it. But then, trying to infer that somebody has a medical diagnosis or using data in a certain way is I think, can be challenging and is a very different kind of use than probably people expected when they use their mouse. And so the way that I would think about this is really focusing less on the data type, right? Is this a body movement, right? So like a mouse movement is a body movement. You could say that's really sensitive and we should regulate it. Say like, it's okay to use your body movement for the purpose of moving the mouse. If you're going to do something that is more sensitive with it, then there are restrictions or there are additional protections that come into place when you do that. And I think that is a really important concept of thinking about, Naomi talked about risk-based frameworks and thinking about things from a risk-based perspective. But I think understanding the context in which data is being used and understanding the value and the positive aspects and also what are the uses that require additional protection. I think that's really important. A good example of this in our work is, we recently announced MetaQuest Pro, which has eye tracking capability. And so, this is an area that, again, really important for basic human interaction to work, right? So, if you and I are in a virtual space and I'm looking you in the eye, the system needs to know that so that it can render it. But again, there are lots of ways that could be used in ways that are less expected and potentially more challenging. And so what we did is we actually spent a lot of time with lots of different experts talking about the need for it, how to protect it, what it would look like. And we put out a white paper sort of simultaneously with releasing the product that talked about the choices that we had made. And so I think that, in a way that's very concrete, and some people may agree or disagree with them, but I think being able to, one, have the conversation in real time as we're building, and then also be clear about what we've decided is a really important aspect of that. And I think the feedback has been that we did, a pretty decent job in managing that and in building some really important features to enable people to connect. When you translate that to big P policy, I think it's actually a similar thing, right? So we've all can think of legal regimes that are very prescriptive, right? So, that say, okay, your privacy policy needs to be in this point font and needs to be displayed in this way, and like these kinds of things, which work well at a moment in time. But then when, now my company's thinking about, virtual and augmented reality. And so the idea of like a link to a privacy policy at this size and this place on a website just isn't a concept that really makes sense. And if your goal is actually to empower people and educate them and enable them to make choices, that's probably not the right model to do it. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have, the very notional, like the reasonableness that I talked about before, which says like, act reasonably and then, we'll figure out what happens if you don't later. And I think that is a good way of future-proofing in the sense that it gives a regulator a lot of discretion, but it's not a good way of future-proofing in the sense of giving really concrete guidance about what needs to happen in a particular place. So if neither of those work, what does? In my experience, there's an idea of using principles-based regulation or principles-based policy that sits somewhere in the middle and that says, okay, we're not going to be as general as be reasonable, right? We're going to actually say things in a way that's concrete and actionable and tells you what to do, but we're not going to specify the implementation, right? You have to tell people prominently X, but we're not going to say it has to be in this link, in this font, in this place. And then that allows people to understand how things should work and what the value judgments that the policy is trying to make without getting into a place where it's not future-proofed. And so the one thing that I think is important in doing that is, I say this actually a lot internally to our teams, when we write policy, it needs to be written in a way that you could disagree with it, right? So saying like, do things that are good for data subjects. Like we all agree, but that doesn't actually help make a decision. Saying you should prioritize privacy. I'll use your data sharing example, right? So you could say it's really important for research to be made available for generalizable knowledge. And even if there's some risk that data might be misused, we think it's important to make the data available. Or you could say the opposite. So you could land in either place, but being clear about that is super important. I think what that allows you to do is to make value judgments that then can be implemented through a multi-stakeholder exercise across different situations. One example of this that I think has been effective, although it's early, is the Age-Appropriate Design Code, which started in the UK, it recently passed in California, but I think is an effort to be opinionated, but also principles-based. So recognizing that what it looks like to protect children and their privacy on a social network is going to look different than what it looks like in a retail store or in lots of different or in a messaging app or in lots of different contexts, and really saying here's what we're aiming for, and in a way that's concrete and actionable and can be translated.
Right. Yeah, and that really brings forward this conversation to me about language, right? And that these multi-stakeholder groups are all using this language differently, and it's something that we talk a lot about with risk communications. And so you sort of see this in the consent frameworks, but you also see this in the sort of value and risk descriptions. Value for whom? Risk to whom of what? Are we more concerned about what's being hidden using privacy, or are we more worried about what's being shared? And I think there are a lot of tensions there in sort of how the lawyers use those words, how the engineers use that language, and how the public uses that language. I mean, we can even look at words like bias, which mean one thing to statisticians who are writing machine learning algorithms, and it means something fundamentally different to the general public. And so I think somehow unpacking some of this language ends up being a really important driver for how we write good policy and how we implement that policy. I guess we're running short on time, but how would you best incorporate those challenges in language and in definition? How do we get a better shared understanding there?
So I think fundamentally, communication is a real challenge in the space because everybody's starting from a different place. Even the word privacy. We've done research. I mean, we actually have published it, and it's on our research website. But what do people mean when they talk about privacy? What do they care about? It actually varies, and we built a taxonomy which helps us make decisions internally about what are the different risks that people might be worried about when they talk about their privacy. And so I think that actually it's kind of two pieces. One is actually being really thoughtful about the communication itself, whether that's communication in the policy space or communication to people. And recognizing, every time you go to a website in Europe, you get a thing that says, there are cookies here and you have to consent to them. Everyone uses websites, so everyone consents to the cookies. But it's not clear that that's how to go back to our earlier discussion, how the cookies are used can matter quite a lot. And so actually thinking about communicating about outcomes rather than this is a technology that you need to know and consent to, I would think about, if you use this website, the information will be used in the following ways, and here are the choices that you have about that. And focusing on the things that are not expected. So, every website uses cookies for a whole range of purposes, some of which are just typical of every website, some of which are unusual, and really focusing on talking about the stuff that people wouldn't expect. I think that's really important. The second thing that I'll say, which I just don't think there's any substitute for, is actually, in the way that we talked about before about talking to governments and experts and engineers, I think it's also talking to people, the people who are actually using products and services whose data is being used, and understanding, hey, when we put this in front of you, do you understand what this means? What do you take from it? And I don't think there's any, those of us who spend their days professionally thinking about data and privacy and all of these things will have one frame for it. But I've learned a lot just from the exercise of putting something in front of people who care a lot about this but don't do it professionally, and seeing what they understand and don't.
Right, it's always about the humans. At the end of the day, these systems have to work for the people who are using them. So thank you so much for taking the time. And with that, I would like to bring up our final panel, the engineering team and group. So please, if we can give Rob a hand of applause, and then.
Ready? First of all, thank you everybody for coming today. This is a really important subject and a really important approach to it. And as Anish talked to us this morning about, we have not made good progress here. We've not even been top of mind to people. But what we're doing is incredibly important. And Ellie and Rob pointed out to us in the session just passed, it's been 15 years, first of all, to get the word data privacy into the State of the Union address. We should be ashamed of ourselves, and our government should be ashamed of itself. But we have an opportunity now. So here's a window of an opportunity. So we have a one-time opportunity for a limited time only to move this forward. And if we're going to move it forward, the policy panel did a great job. By the way, I'm panel Peel, forgot to do that. The policy panel did a great job of talking about the need for policy and how we go about it and how we get started. And we have to get started. And everybody has been waiting to figure out where to put their step first. Where's the first step? I don't know, I don't care. Just make a step. Let's go. So we go forward. But as we go forward on a policy perspective, we actually have to do it. And here are the doers. And so I'm going to start off with, I'm going to ask each of our panelists here, we have a very esteemed set of panelists here, to both introduce themselves, and then I want you to tell me what is top of mind. What is top of mind to you around data privacy? And can you give me and us a discrete example of a solution to the data policy and privacy issue, whether it worked or not? A solution. So I'm going to start with Robbie.
With me?
Yes, you.
Oh, thank you. Okay. I thought we were going this way. But
No,
anyway,
you're not doing it. I
thank
know.
you so much for I like randomness. That's pretty good. So I'm Kobe Nissim. I'm local. I'm a professor here at the Department of Computer Science, but I'm also affiliated with the law school. I'm a computer scientist. I'm not a lawyer. And I've been working on privacy for about a little more than 2 decades now. My background is in theoretical computer science, and my PhD thesis was in cryptography and secure computing. And cryptography is this field where, like in the late 70s, there was nothing but a revolution in the way we do crypto. It kind of turned from kind of an art to a field, a scientific field that has mathematical foundations, and we have been thinking about definitions, and we've been mathematical definitions of cryptographic concepts, and we've been building them and making concise assumptions on whenever we need to do that, and we've been proving that systems are secure and so on. And when I came to started thinking about privacy, I kind of expected the field to be similar, and it turned out that it was very different. Like looking at papers from the 70s up in the privacy literature, when I started working on this in 2002, I could not find those definitions, and it was not clear what actually, I could see a lot of techniques, but it was not clear what was the purpose of this technique and what they are protecting against and so on. And with a group of researchers, we started thinking of how to put privacy on sound mathematical grounds in the similar way to what happened in cryptography just in the late 70s. And this line of work, on one hand, introduced concepts that I think are going to be useful, like differential privacy. We invented differential privacy and introduced it in 2006, and it's a concept that began just in the theoretical world, but now is beginning to have impact on the real world. And also this scientific mathematical study of privacy has taught us a lot of other things, and also brought a lot of, or at least some, bad news. And I think the biggest one is what we call composition in our jargon, which means what happens when you compute with privacy over the same or similar data or data of the same population again and again and again, and you produce new insights. And the unfortunate reality, mathematical reality, is that this erodes privacy over time, even if what you're computing are aggregates like statistics, machine learning models, and so on. And this is kind of a mathematical fact that we cannot get around, which tells us we have to balance things here. There is the utility you want to get from the data, and everybody understands this utility, and then there are the privacy risks that grow as we make more and more use of the data. And if we want to preserve privacy, we'll have to, in some sense, hamper utility. And one of the first examples of this was in the theoretical work I did with Ivry Dinur in 2006, which introduced a concept that we call reconstruction attacks. Reconstruction attacks are attacks that use the legitimate access to a mechanism. In our case, it was a system that produces statistics, and maybe to protect, to give privacy protection, maybe it introduces noises or inaccuracies in the computation. And yet we showed that it was possible to access this mechanism that only provides information about large populations with noise and reconstruct the underlying data very accurately. And this is a phenomena that initially was only shown in theoretical papers, but later on in the last few years also in practice. So I think what we've seen, what I've seen in this 20-something years working on this is, yes, you can create sound foundational basis for talking about privacy. You need to be very careful to make clear what you are talking about, because privacy is this huge problem. If you put 10 experts in the room, you will get 20 answers to the question what you think privacy is. And this is one of the reasons I think we should call concepts like differential privacy. It's not it doesn't relate to the entire privacy problem, but it carves out a significant portion of it, but there are a lot of other things to be done. And we can slowly build this math, and over time it may also turn into technology, and this is reassuring. Another thing I've been doing in the last 8 or so years is starting to look at privacy policy and beginning to realize that privacy is actually not a concept, not a technical concept originally. It's a concept that comes from philosophy and political science and law and other areas. And then now it also has a technical face to it, and we have to deal with a technical face. And one important question is this really the same thing? Like if the fact that we call differential privacy, does it mean that it's about privacy? If that's how it works, let's call it differential giraffes, and we'll have now a theory about giraffes, right? The same theory, by the way. And it can't be that this is the answer. So there is a question of how do we make sure that the technical solutions that we provide and the theory that develop actually talk about the real thing, about privacy as it's being understood in regulation, in the philosophical thinking, and so on. And this is a challenge that I see. I've been working with legal scholars over the last 8 years. I remember the first meetings, one of the first meetings I told them I heard a survey that said only in the US there are about more than 2,000 privacy regulations, and they told me, oh, don't worry about it, there are a lot of duplicates. It's only 1,200, okay? I don't know how to work technically with so many regulations and analyze their effect, and I would guess that many others don't either. And so part of what I'm trying to do now is to see how we develop methodologies to bridge between this legal thinking about privacy and the technical thinking about privacy. And one of the things you see started to look into it is that actually we've been working in very divergent ways, although we're using the same terms, okay? But we mean the same words mean very different things. We're using very different arguments, and we have very different goals in these two disciplines. So how do we bridge them? And again, coming from the mathematical background, maybe one of my goals is to see if we can maybe create legal theorems. Okay, the same way we do, we have mathematical theorems. Can we prove mathematically that a technology satisfies or does not satisfy the requirements of a legal standard. And we have some successes in this direction. I'll be happy to tell about them. I just don't want to take too much time. And to your last question, one thing that I'm thinking about and worried about is that whether we're participating in kind of a privacy theater and a kind of and the technology and all the good things and good intentions are kind of in some way wasted on doing a privacy theater, and also kind of bars us from thinking about another question. What if we are losing privacy? What do we do then? Do we understand what privacy was supposed to give us? What kind of value it brings to society? And can we develop policies and technology in order to compensate for this loss of privacy? I think this is something that we are at large missing in the discussion. There's been some work in theoretical computer science in the last decade or so on fairness and discrimination, which I think goes in this direction, because if fairness and discrimination are issues that we thought privacy deals with, even if we don't get privacy, maybe we can integrate that into our systems. So this is a big question that I think is currently, like, what do we do if we lose privacy? I'm not saying that we should stop working on developing privacy technology and privacy policy, but I think we should also inject into the discussion this question.
Thank you, Robbie. So, Mallory, as Robbie pointed out to us, this is not a 20-second solution. He's been working on it for decades. So can you, A, introduce yourself, and then tell us a little bit about what is top of mind to you around data privacy and importantly, the actual, it's not the policy is important, for sure. What we call it is a big deal. And Robbie's right. We use the same words, we mean something entirely different, which is a barrier to just getting something on paper. But something around an actual solution.
Yeah, I can make an attempt. So I'm Mallory Nodal. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm also a member of the Internet Architecture Board, where I think best describe my work at the CDT as being one of multi-stakeholder internet governance. So I appreciate the approach here to be multi-stakeholder. I think it's a good approach. And then, at CDT, then we have a program that's largely focused on the open internet and what that means, as preserving it in the way that it operates now as a public good, and it's very much sort of the underlying basis for a lot of the conversation we're having here. So I would describe then the sort of three things we focus on as being to preserve end-to-end encryption and also make it more ubiquitous as a tool or as a mechanism for providing privacy, or as I like to think of it, data protection. It's another synonym that I think is a little bit more specific in what that means. The second area is around minimizing the harms of targeted web advertising, or working on web advertising more generally, and as well as coming up with or supporting other models for advertising that aren't so privacy invasive. And then the last one is around interoperability, which is actually probably more related right now in the moment to the first question around encryption, as we think that interoperability is, for its own sake, really important, even though currently there's legislation that is sort of invoking principles of interoperability for the purposes of antitrust and competition. We've, for a long time, talked about the importance of interoperability as an architecture, and so are currently working on that. I'll have to check my notes. But I think that some examples, right? I think that there's some good examples that have made major privacy gains in the recent past around private end-to-end, or I would say private is actually redundant, end-to-end encrypted messaging that is feature-rich and that's usable and that's allowing more and more people to not just have confidential conversations, but have actually a whole variety and range of ways to communicate with not just their friends and loved ones, but businesses and practitioners, doctors, bankers. Maybe that's not as popular here, but in parts of the global South and other places, over-the-top services that use end-to-end encryption are used for everything. And so that's been really fantastic. And I think it actually, though, speaks to this tension now that we're talking about interoperable forms of communication that have been around for a long time but kind of don't work well. And why aren't those interoperable messaging systems that predate end-to-end encrypted messaging being used? My main example of that is email. It was mentioned before that one doctor could send the other a file now through encrypted email. It is incredibly difficult to use for end users. If you've ever tried to get OpenPGP running on an email client, it's tough. I wouldn't recommend it to my next door neighbor, but in some cases maybe it makes sense. And so thinking about how then the sort of walled garden or the completely inoperable, but you have all control of the ecosystem has really worked for users of tools in terms of the features that are offered, and the main one obviously then being encryption, but then also then how that's being challenged in policy. And we won't talk about policy, but as somebody who is focused on the technology, I do spend then a great deal of time worried about the policy challenges to the use of end-to-end encryption, which are bubbling up very specifically right now in the UK, the EU, and it's sometimes in the US even. Another, I think, example, I'm going to switch now to talk about web advertising, because that's another thing that I mentioned we focus on a lot.
Mallory, before you leave end-to-end encryption, sure, which I think is really important, and it was brought up earlier today about the ability to move sensitive information, i.e. private data, across. Mm-hmm. So end-to-end encryption was an engineering solution to that.
Yes.
Were there unintended consequences from the end-to-end? It solved one problem, did it create another?
So it depends on who you ask and kind of what problems we're talking about, but I do think that it creates an environment of constraint, and those constraints are important. And this is one of the areas of inquiry and research in the interoperable space that I'm curious about. And as well as building out more features. So for example, if we want people to feel safe, if we want to make sure there is accountability for the folks using these apps that for criminal purposes or other things, we need to think about more features that still fit within the constraint of it being an end-to-end secure communication that don't break the promise of the privacy and confidentiality features of end-to-end encryption. So I can go on, but maybe just really briefly, if you're going to use user reporting, say you're using an end-to-end encrypted messaging app, and someone sends you a piece of content that you don't want, or it's from a user that you don't know, how do you block and report them in a way that is privacy respecting, because you also don't want these reporting and blocking mechanisms to be retaliatory or abused in and of themselves. So how do you create that feature such that the central service knows something about it and can help you mitigate that threat as an end user, but in a privacy-preserving way that doesn't actually break the confidentiality of the communication? That's not a straightforward problem, but people have worked on it. There's ways that folks are trying out, but there's a whole slew of possible mitigations that would then need to fit within the constraints of that confidential system. So yeah, another one then on privacy-respecting web advertising. I think a good example, well, we're trying to actually generate examples of web advertising that can be done in a way that the end users don't feel is being targeted at them, because I think there's a pervasive sense that, well, this is the sort of model that we have to live with, but it makes me feel a little uncomfortable. I have no way to avoid it if I want to participate in social media or other kinds of online civic life, so we just sort of tacitly accept it. But that isn't entirely true, because I think there are examples already in use of advertising that doesn't use user data, or that doesn't target the user with ads in a way that still allows for innovation and commerce, and so that users also feel like they're getting interesting products and things like that. So let me get specific. So one is contextual advertising. So if I'm doing a search or actually actively looking for something, that is then sort of consent to, please show me ads, please show me content that actually really properly fits the terms I'm looking for. If I'm reading an article about a subject, it might indicate that I would then want to see an ad for this. So it's more based on the content being accessed, less about the person accessing it. And then the last one I'll share, which I just learned about, and I will call out the company. I try not to do that, but it's because I didn't learn about it directly from them. I was reading an article in the New Yorker. Netflix used to use a really complicated algorithm to try to figure out what you wanted to watch, specifically us, right? And they don't do that anymore. In fact, they kind of laugh it off as being like, oh, we were so silly back then, because what they do now is they scoop up what you want to watch so that they can make the best TV possible, so that they can improve their product and create television shows and movies that everybody wants to watch based on watching preferences. So they still use that user data, but they're not using it to target you. They're using it because it helps them build better products. And that, to me, seems like something that we all sort of benefit from. And I would love to hear more models about that as we sort of push back against the whole sort of architecture itself. So those are a couple of examples, because I know you wanted specific examples, but I'll just end by talking about the kinds of things that are on my mind. And mostly this has come, so this is why I'm reading notes, because it's mostly come from what everybody has said so far. Everybody who's been able to speak has really been inspiring to me and helped me reframe some of these issues. I think one of the things that I worry about a lot is the sort of architectural design between an API versus approach that has been invoked and mentioned before, versus a sort of revisiting or re-architecting it from the ground up approach. And I don't actually think that we should think of it as an either or. I think we should really look for ways that we can do both, depending on the situation. And so some examples are, if we do interoperable end-to-end encryption, an API approach would be a horrible idea, because obviously that would then break that sort of end-to-end architecture, because you'd have to have a middle. So that's out, right? There may be other things like that where we really want to reject the idea that we need to do an API. I was going to sort of push back on that idea that Venmo's great. I resent having to use Venmo, because I've lived in Canada, I've lived in Kenya, I've lived in the UK, and you can send people money without another app because the banking system in those countries, and I think most countries, actually lets you do that directly, right? And so there are things that maybe it's a good idea to just tear it all down, rebuild it from the ground up with the right stakeholders in the room to figure out a solution that's more elegant. Maybe that's just my bias. I find the protocol or the redesign a little bit more elegant. And I think I'll stop there. So thanks again.
Thank you, Mallory. Yes, elegance is always welcomed in the room. So Alyssa, I'm going to turn to you here and ask you to, again, tell us what is top of mind to you around, first introduce yourself, and then tell us what's top of mind to you around data privacy and something around from a solutions perspective to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You'll be last, obviously.
Happy to be here. Sorry, Mark. So I'm Alyssa Cooper. I'm Vice President of Ecosystem Engineering and a fellow at Cisco Systems, the big IT company, not the food company. So what I do at Cisco is I work to shape how we engage in what we call technology ecosystems. So technical standardization, open source communities, external research partnerships, and co-innovation with other industry partners. all in service of thinking about how do we do long-term technology incubation that will benefit the industry and will benefit our particular portfolio. I've also previously worked in our collaboration technology group, which is the part of the company that sells voice, video, messaging. If anybody's used WebEx, that's like our signature product there, a competitor for Teams and Zoom and all the other applications that we've gotten used to using during COVID. In my career, I've spent a lot of time, about more than 15 years, working and thinking about the architecture of the internet, the protocols that we use to build the internet, and how the design of those protocols and that architecture furthers the empowerment of end users, supports privacy, and increases connectivity across the globe. So I kind of got into this work through privacy as a gateway drug, and then have expanded out since then to think about many other aspects of the design of the internet. So I will start with a couple of examples from that experience that I do think are true success stories, and I will caution you that I'm kind of a cynic and a renegade a little bit in thinking about what the lessons are that we draw from this experience. So be prepared. The first one I'm going to talk about is the initiative to encrypt the web. So if you go back to 2013, 2014, something like 30% of connections between users' browsers on the one end and websites and servers on the opposite end of those connections were encrypted on the wire. So if I was an eavesdropper in these connections, about 30% of the time, I wouldn't be able to decipher the traffic that was going back and forth between myself and the Cisco website or the Google website or the New York Times website. But for 70% of the connections, those were in the clear, and any passive eavesdropper would be able to see all of the data going back and forth. So this is, you can think about this as, when you have the lock icon or what used to be the green lock icon in your browser, that's how you know that this connection is protected. And there were some important events that occurred in 2013, namely the disclosures that Edward Snowden made about mass surveillance on the internet. So prior to 2013, I was a person who had worked on privacy, on thinking about this very data leaky architecture that we had for the internet, because if we go back 40, 50 years to when the internet was first designed, it was all people who knew each other and trusted each other. So we didn't actually design the fundamentals of the internet to protect data in transit, because of course, this is a network that has 64 nodes on it. It's never going to get that big. We all trust each other. We don't need to encrypt anything. That design showed its age quite quickly. But as somebody who cared about privacy and was working to try to change some of these things, it was really an uphill battle. There's a lot of ease of use that comes from having all this data accessible to you in the clear, not just on the endpoints, but as the operator of networks. When you can see every bit of traffic that's going across your network, it facilitates a lot of ease of use in terms of how you manage and control that network. So trying to say, hey, we should really shield more of this data, or we shouldn't be sending so much data back and forth just to effectuate a communication between two endpoints on the internet was really an uphill battle. That changed significantly after the Snowden disclosures, because there was suddenly this revelation that this architecture that we built was being massively exploited for a purpose to which many, many citizens and consumers felt was out of line, right? Was not in line with expectations, as was discussed previously. And it also had a big impact on the companies that were implicated by these disclosures, that suddenly there was a sort of branding and competitive imperative to change this. The other thing that happened in this time frame, sort of starting 2014, was that the tools that are needed for any given website out of the millions and billions of websites that are out there to be able to more easily deploy encryption on the server side became much easier to use. There was a widespread industry effort to make the certificates that we use for web encryption freely available. So if you've heard of Let's Encrypt, that's a certificate authority that you can now, any website can go and get a free certificate from it. And the automation needed to effectuate all of that on the server side became much simpler. So the combination of a sort of push from the browser side and from the big companies that were serving web traffic, and the automation and ease of use of these tools, and that drive, that competitive and branding drive to encrypt the web, in short order, say by 2017, 2018, more than 90% of connections on the web became encrypted, and that remains true today. So this is like a very stark difference that you can look and say, previously, were we protecting people's privacy? Not really. We were doing not a great job. Are we doing it today? Absolutely. The web is a different place today than it was 10 years ago on this one particular aspect of privacy. And all of this, again, not driven by policy, right? Driven entirely by other factors out there. And this was not mandated. It was not required by any regulator. I mean, it's required in certain regulated verticals, but in terms of the web, the broad-based web itself, not mandated by any policy. The other example that I'll give is user tracking on the web and on mobile applications. So if we go back to 2017, Safari launched something called Intelligent Tracking Protection, which by default restricts the use of third-party cookies on the web by parties on the server side. So I think people are probably familiar with third-party cookies, a really important mechanism that advertisers and other companies that do tracking make use of in order to be able to continuously re-identify that this is the same user as they go from site to site, service to service, and to build profiles of these users in order to be able to target them. So starting in 2017, we started to see the browsers put up more shields to defend against this kind of tracking. Safari in 2017, Firefox in 2019, and then in 2021, we saw this same concept come to the mobile app ecosystem when Apple deployed app tracking transparency. And the important feature that all of these steps had in common was that they were turned on by default. And I think this is true of Apple. I mean, Apple pops a consent screen, but they say, do you want to be tracked? And everybody says no. And so essentially, you can consider that these protections are turned on by default. They don't require, again, not mandated by policy, not requiring the user to go search around in some complicated set of menus and figure it out. They don't require anybody to install an extension into the browser. None of these things. This is a privacy protection that is silently in the background, serving users every day on all of those platforms. And again, driven by competitive differentiation. So I talked about Safari, I talked about Mozilla. I believe there's actually similar protections in Microsoft Edge now. Those companies have a branding and a profile that they want to put out there in terms of being the privacy saviors, right? They're out there to protect the user. They're a user agent. They're actually trying to serve the user's interest. There's one that I didn't name, which is Chrome, and Chrome does not block third-party cookies by default. I'm not putting you on the spot. I know it's not your job. But so what do we learn? What are the common themes across both of these examples, right? Is that you can actually make meaningful privacy improvements. They don't need to be driven by policy. I previously worked more on the policy side. It has been not 15 years, 25 years waiting for federal privacy legislation. Stop waiting. Even when it comes, it wouldn't effectuate these kinds of protections, right? These things that actually help people today and are helping everybody on the web today, federal privacy legislation isn't going to get you this. So you can do these things when there's a competitive drive to do so. And the most important thing is that you turn them on by default and you give people these protections silently without making them hop through consent screens and get pop-up fatigue and all these other things. You don't put the burden on the user. You take the burden on as the service provider. So what's top of mind for me today is finding more opportunities to follow that model and to effectuate that on the internet. I'm also working quite a bit with Mallory on interoperable end-to-end encrypted messaging, and I think this is another opportunity where we get to do that. And just to give one more layer on that, all of engineering is trade-offs. Every time we go to make something more performant, then we think about, can we still make it as secure? When we think about end-to-end encrypted messaging and voice and video, I will also say, there's lots of great functionality that we get from having centralized exposure to the data as it goes back and forth on a messaging or a voice or a video application. So for, just take video as an example, transcoding, and you have multiple video streams that if you have a centralized server that can see all this data, oh, we can get you one really nice video stream to each endpoint because we have a server doing all this processing in the middle. When you start encrypting all the data, you can't do the processing in the middle, and you have to think about how you do the processing at the ends. But I think I think all of this is totally feasible to do in an interoperable way for messaging and voice and video. I think the same is true for moderation and abuse, that we can put these protections at the end and have a workable system where we have both privacy and security, and we have a feature-rich ecosystem of services. And so that's something that I'm working on now and looking forward to seeing come to fruition.
So those are excellent examples, and I really, as an economist, I really appreciate the idea that privacy was driven by competitiveness, not by the government dictating or some other policy dictating, but in the absence of somebody putting a structure around it, just the competition between companies to give them a competitive edge brought them to the privacy table. And last but not least, Mark, tell us a little bit, again, tell us who you are, but tell us what's top of mind to you in this world of data privacy and your thoughts around solutions to it.
So, folks, Mark.
Thanks for being here, everybody.
Yeah, sure. Mark Crandall. I am Director of Privacy and head of our privacy effort for Google Cloud.
Are you a lawyer?
I am a lawyer. I have a legal background, but I've been part of engineering for the last 10, 12 years, actually, during my time at Google. And my primary job is to try to translate the legal requirements that we will obtain from our legal peers in the legal department, from our privacy council, and then translate that into something that is functional, deployable, pragmatic by our engineering teams. As we learned in the policy panel earlier, you can't go to an engineer and say build something that is reasonable in terms of privacy protections. They will eat you alive. Well, what about this? What about that? How do you do this? What about that? What about this situation? What about that situation? Now, of course, we want to talk about end goals and what otherwise would be achievable and useful for our users. But at the end of the day, we need to provide something that's pragmatic and deployable and buildable by our engineering teams. So I think one of my biggest concerns right now with respect to that is translating quite stringent requirements like those we might get out of GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, and in implementing those in a way that is feasible for our engineering teams. Not only that, but we do have 2,000 potential privacy frameworks. And yes, boiling it down to 1,200 is potentially of great relief, but you don't want to go to engineering colleagues with 1,200 privacy requirements. So what we typically try to do from, again, a pragmatic perspective is try to divide all of these requirements up into buckets. What are the similarities between these various frameworks? What are the differences? What are the outliers? And then how can we engineer for these similarities across these multiple frameworks? And then in terms of areas where we want to apply these controls, really these common controls across these frameworks, what areas or what data stores contain the most personal data? In other words, what do we want to look at first? Where do we have to apply these protections? Where do we get the most bang for our engineering buck in terms of focusing our resources? So we want to find commonalities across these various frameworks. We want to look at the data stores that contain personal data and the ones that contain the most personal data and the most sensitive of that data, and then focus our efforts there first of all. The second thing is to provide common frameworks across the engineering teams and common guidelines. From a scalability perspective, we have thousands of engineers at Google, and even within Google Cloud, which again is our business to business. We provide cloud services to other businesses that deploy in our systems, and productivity services like Workspace, and Gmail is the consumer-facing version of that. But how do we do that in a scalable way? And that is another thing that is top of mind for us. So first of all, we want to provide guidelines that are deployable and understandable and usable to all of our engineering and product management teams. What is personal data? How does personal data differ from personally identifiable information? How does that differ from PHI if you're looking at HIPAA? What if you have privacy requirements that are specific to a banking sector in Europe or South Africa or Brazil? So we provide overall guidelines for our engineering teams that they can use as they start developing their products and services. But then the other thing that we try to do as a privacy team, again, embedded within engineering and working with product management, is to provide arm's length guidance as the products themselves are being built and developed. And we are there to help not only provide the guidance, but also to help guide in particular directions when it comes to decisions that we may need to make when it comes to engineering realities and practicalities. So for example, at Google, we have what are called privacy working groups, which are basically teams of program managers, people with compliance backgrounds, engineering backgrounds, legal backgrounds, and our job is to serve as consultants for the engineering and product management teams. We are not embedded with those specific teams. We are at arm's length, so we can provide some sort of objective, what we would say, objective suggestions in terms of the product development process, but not slow down the teams in providing. One example I like to give is I like to say we'd like to provide the yellow light, but not necessarily the red light. In other words, our job is not to say no, but rather how can we achieve your goal without creating these privacy risks? In other words, what ultimately do you need to achieve that would allow us to help achieve that in a way that is privacy protecting, but also buildable by engineering? So, so again, top of mind is translating what otherwise would be vague or difficult legal requirements into something which can be deployable specifically, doing it at scale, which means finding commonalities across different privacy frameworks and data protection frameworks, providing broader guidance so that it can be deployed or ingested by product and engineering teams, and then providing meaningful pragmatic guidance, including getting in early during the product development and design process so that pro-privacy protecting technologies can be developed and deployed during the product development lifecycle. So those are the areas that we focus on.
Thank you. This has been a great panel. I would love to carry on with them a little longer, but we are over time. And so I'm going to thank our panelists for sharing their insights and suggestions with us, and I'm going to turn it over to Ellie to bring us home with the closing remarks.
So thank you all. I know we are a touch past time and just wrapping up here, but just to pull forward a couple of the really big key themes here. I mean, at the core of it, these are some of, like I said at the beginning, the very best thinkers and who are putting together the policies, crafting the policy as it needs to be, both the big P and the little p policy, and really then figuring out how we build these systems. So this hopefully is certainly not, neither is it the only conversation happening right now on these topics, nor is it going to be the last, and we will certainly be pushing forward on this and continuing it as we start to get to some federal privacy regulation. To Alyssa's point, it's not going to be the be-all and end-all, and ultimately we're going to have to build the systems and figure out what's possible, and then realistically the policy will follow, and then they're going to continue iterating on each other. And that's the way that good policy ends up being built and written, but also the way good engineering systems end up meeting that policy and then crafting and refining and building upon it. The whole goal here is that we can ultimately end up with a relatively sort of coherent description of what privacy is and meet both the technical and the human understanding of what privacy means and how privacy works in our world. And then to Andrew's point, expanding far beyond what is just privacy to this broader domain of data policy, because really it isn't just about privacy. It's also how do we understand and use data and use it across all of these different industries to really do the things that we want and need to be able to do in the world while making sure that we're taking care of the humans whose data it represents and whose lives are captured in those data. So thank you all for your time. I've really enjoyed the conversation and very much looking forward to the future. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.